thank you for those introductions. It sounds like you've all signed up to or you're all expecting that this is the presentation. So going to look at debt advice and financial capability best practice for working with people in the criminal justice system. And this presentation really is one of the launches of a project, a joint project between the Ministry of Justice and Nottingham Trent University called DAPE, Developing Academic Policy and Engagement. And before we talk about the substance of how we went about this project and what our findings are, I thought it'd just be helpful. There's a few slides to explain a little bit more about that partnership between the MOJ and Nottingham Trent University. And so if I can hand over to Grace. So if you want to indicate, Grace, shall I go down to the next slide?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, hi everyone. As I mentioned before, I'm Grace, part of the Evidence and Partnerships Hub at the Ministry of Justice. And quite a while back now, I was involved in sort of setting up and facilitating the MOJ involvement in DAPE. So coordinated 3 different projects, of which this is one. So just want to spend a couple of minutes just briefly providing a bit of context to the sort of collaboration and how that fits within our broader partnership strategy and the objectives of the Evidence and Partnerships Hub within MOJ. So we're quite a small team within the Data and Analysis Directorate with a kind of overall broad aim to adopt a more strategic approach to developing the evidence base, and with a big emphasis on doing that through more effective engagement with external expertise, so engaging with academic community. So as a hub, we have 6 sort of broad objectives. Won't kind of read them all out, but broadly there's sort of evidence related ones on the left and partnerships related ones on the right, and this DAPE collaboration falls really nicely in the middle, where we're sort of building and enhancing the evidence base through sort of proactive and really sort of meaningful engagement with academic experts such as Richard and Almighty on this project. If you just want to flick on to the next slide, please, Richard. Yeah, so as mentioned, today's presentation has come about through this collaboration with Nottingham Trent University through the Developing Academic Policy Engagement Programme. And collaborations like this are very much in line with our broader partnership strategy. So this is all about enhancing our strategic research capabilities through these kind of collaborations. So building up our networks, engaging with research funders, and this partnership strategy is very much grounded in our MOJ areas of research interest as well. So the strategy sort of provides the mechanisms and structures and networks as a bit of a basis for us and to support colleagues to do more of this sort of meaningful academic policy engagement work. Just flick on to the next slide, please, Richard. So I'm just double checking Karen's not on the call, as I think Karen was hoping to. No, I don't think so. Yeah, so just to briefly explain a little bit more about the DAPE sort of programme. So this is coordinated by Nottingham Trent University. So we worked really closely with the facilitators to sort of scope out what projects we might be able to do together. So essentially the idea is for academics to provide this expertise in interpreting an evidence base and sort of producing really focused and defined outputs to support sort of policy and practice and build up that evidence base, and working collaboratively and closely with colleagues within the department. So in this case, Rachel was closely involved, sort of MOJ analyst, and making those links with policy teams as well. So it's really effective means of knowledge exchange, really. So we're really glad to be able to present the findings and have the kind of output published as well. So yeah, I think with that in mind, I'll pass back to you, Richard, to kind of get into the more interesting bit. Thanks.
No, that's great. Thank you. That background's important to how the project came about. So thank you. So yeah, the themes that we'll look at in this session that very much arise from the production of a best practice toolkit are we want to highlight best practice for policymakers and professionals working in criminal justice and social welfare sectors, exploring some of those experiences of people with an offending history who have debt problems. We'll talk briefly about common types of debt that are accrued. And quite a bit of the focus actually today is about trying to present and think around some of the complexities of working with people in the criminal justice system who experience debt, and to think about how we can approach that working situation effectively, and to provide an evidence base and those strategies for people working in this area. And some of you may have already seen the guide. It's only been recently published. So what we'll certainly do after the presentation today is to make sure that everyone in the call is sent the link to the guide that we're talking about this morning. That's freely available on NTU's website. So by all means, do have a look at that link, share that with your colleagues. If there's feedback on that's a kind of we want that to be a document that's useful for practice. If there's things that you think perhaps that we can add to that in time, that would be helpful. And the remainder of the presentation talks about what we found from this project and the key elements in the best practice guide. Just very briefly, a couple of things about how we put the guides together. So as Grace has just said, the academic staff, Almighty and I from NTU, worked really closely with the Ministry of Justice. We completed a literature review for literature in this area around debt and offending, which was interesting. That you're probably aware that there is some literature in this area. I wouldn't say there's a massive amount of literature. There was enough that we could draw on to make this meaningful, but there wasn't a huge amount of academic literature. So some of the literature that we've drawn on is more practice-based, grey literature, as we refer to it in the academic trade, from organisations such as NACRO and the charity sector. And also, it's really good that Sarah from Derby Advice is here. Really important part of the project was that I did some interviews with debt advisors from the East Midlands who were really experienced in working in the debt field, but specifically with people engaged in the criminal justice system. So something about the background. So I'm sure, because there's such a high level of expertise on the call here, that the kind of underlying issues that were revealed through the literature won't come as a surprise to people. The first point there, I think, it is important, is that delivering debt advice and financial capability is a really important element of support for prisoners and ex-offenders, and has been found to be critical to the resettlement process. So it's perhaps an area that might not be seen as a mainstream element of support, but I think really it is an important component in the resettlement process and in that package of support. And the literature clearly showed that there are links between debt and offending behaviour, that during periods of debt enforcement, crime levels often increase. And again, this, I guess, would be what we would expect, but I think really important to emphasise that the literature clearly demonstrated an overrepresentation of certain minority groups within the system and experiencing debt problems. So we see the third point there, an overrepresentation of minority ethnic groups, those on low incomes in the indebted population and the criminal justice system. The links between debt and crime often underpinned by adverse childhood experiences, mental health issues, substance misuse and unemployment. it's clear from the literature that there's a gendered experience here, and some of the literature highlighted the need for debt advice to be targeted or tailored for women, and also some close links between debt and delinquency, particularly amongst adolescent males. So, um, and I know that for sure there's quite a number of you on this call who will know more and are much more experts on the technicalities of debt work and different categorizations of debts than I am. But this is an infographic that is taken from the report and really indicates the common types of debt that people might experience. So we've got priority debts and non-priority debts. And just to make that really clear, that priority debts are those that have serious consequences if not paid. So could be loss of a person's home, disconnection, deductions from wages, or repossession of goods, or indeed imprisonment. And the non-priority debts, while still important, are less serious. Enforcement action can be taken, perhaps a county court judgment, or the debt being passed to a debt collection agency. And I think perhaps overall, I would say that that categorization that we can see on the screen there of priority and non-priority debts would be the same for any vulnerable group that we might be discussing who's experiencing debt problems. I think what was interesting, this particularly came out from discussions with MOJ staff, was around the asterisk point there about debts to drug dealers or other prisoners not being considered a priority in legal terms, but in practical terms might require urgent action. And I thought that was a kind of important point around how a debt advisor clearly is approaching someone's debt picture with using the framework of legislation and the categorization of a priority or non-priority debt. But actually, there's this complication often, these additional complicating factors for people in the criminal justice system, where a debt that for us looking at a slide might be termed non-priority, such as a debt to another prisoner or to a drug dealer, but that might require urgent action almost in the same way that that a priority debt would. So this slide, having looked at some of those main types of debts, this slide tries to encompass what we've found about financial capability and the importance of financial capability for offenders and ex-offenders. So again, I think a lot of this might be familiar territory for you. So by financial capability, we're talking about the knowledge and understanding of financial concepts and risks, the skills and motivation to apply that knowledge. So it's really important, I suppose, that what we found from our conversations in the literature is that alongside the technical support with debts that is really important to people, it is this promoting of financial capability or financial literacy for people. And I guess this is where the skills that people need on an ongoing basis are really important, so that debt work isn't hopefully just about crisis management and intervening in one moment, but trying to promote and foster some skills in people and an understanding in people that they'll be able to use going forward. Challenges, though, there are certainly challenges in that. So we can see the second point for prisoners and ex-offenders, that the level of financial capability often low, but that's important if we're going to avoid this cycle that I've alluded to. Often financial capability is part of a contractual agreement between prisons and debt advice agency, and research has shown that it's more effective delivering this financial capability element in a prison setting. some of the nuts and bolts of this then. So it can be about financial capability, can mean in practical terms around budgeting skills, things like opening and managing a bank account. And also it was interesting that, again, from the literature, but also our professional conversations, that the importance of dispelling myths about different types of debts and those conversations to have with people about um, those categorizations of debt, about fines and enforcement. And there often been a really low level of knowledge around different types of debt and what the consequences are, can be around providing access to reliable credit instead of relying on illegal or informal money lenders. So the next three slides really highlight some of the areas of complexity about working with people in the criminal justice system who experience debt-related issues. And what was absolutely clear is that the debt advice process is a time-consuming, legally complex process, full stop. But for people in prison, it's going to be even more complicated. But conversely, advisors often are going to have less direct contact with service users. So it's a consideration in terms of the service delivery and how services are delivered. Some of those logistics of delivering debt advice can be problematic. So delays in receiving credit reports or information from creditors perhaps not responding directly to advisor, and basic communications can be quite tricky. There might be issues with in-person appointments being restricted, and just those initial gathering of information and taking instruction can be difficult. Further debts might be accrued through the informal economy during the debt advice process. And we found that these, hopefully, the best practice guides, we aim to give some general guidance around best practice approach, but often there are very different systems that are operating within different contracts, different prisons and probation services. And so I guess that complicates it as well. And for us trying to provide some holistic guidance about a good approach to this system, but it does need to be tailored to the individual circumstance as well. Confidentiality and consent was another issue of complication that came up. So often people might have confidentiality concerns about how personal and debt information is stored, concerns around if other people become aware of debts, concerns about the physical space in which debt advice is delivered. That's again a practical consideration for work in this area. Is the work with people going to be face to face or remote, and thinking about privacy and confidentiality in those different environments. Working with host agencies then is really important, ensuring that the face-to-face debt advice is delivered in that safe and private space, referral processes ensuring confidentiality. And the research has shown that information sharing protocols can make it difficult to access information from creditors on a prisoner's behalf, and passing information from prisoners to external organisations can be really difficult. So it's that balance between, yes, of course, needing to uphold data confidentiality, but also sometimes I think the processes can obstruct the smooth running of the debt advice process. And the final point there about needing a clear line of communication, often with members of staff from the Department of Work and Pensions, where there are benefit issues as well, and having that network of professionals that you can that you need to liaise with. And finally, in terms of this recognition of complexities in this area, is suspicion of authority. So I guess again that is an obvious point to make, that suspicion of authority can be a dominant feature in working in this area. Of course, that could extend to work undertaken by debt advice workers. And it was interesting, we've seen the second point there, that some of the literature pointed to the values base of debt work and working in a non-judgmental way. And we identified some of these concepts of negative and positive cultures in a prison environment. So positive cultures associated with clear boundaries, confidence and professional knowledge, and negative cultures characterized by focus on control and disrespect. So coming from a social welfare background myself, the kind of values that are very much part of the approach of a debt advisor, I think do mould towards producing those positive cultures. So debt advisors emphasising that their important role, emphasising the importance of consent and confidentiality, and the penultimate point there is, of course, a challenge, but around trying to empower people where possible. Yes, the debt advice process is complex in practical terms and in legal terms, but trying to work with people and for them to understand the process. And finally, the establishment of trust, a really important element in the process when dealing with debt issues. So exploring how income can be maximised, looking at financial capability, drawing up financial statements, and sensitively exploring and pursuing all the available options. The other element that was really clear from our conversations and the literature, whilst we were focusing on debt and financial capability, is seeing this as one element in a much bigger picture of complex need. So financial insecurity and debt often accompanied with vulnerabilities in relation to mental health, drug and alcohols, relationships, and housing. So really the importance, again, of this, of course, is hardwired into the toolkit of a debt advice worker that you're signposting to other services. But I think really important to have your allies and organisations that you can signpost to it when working with in this environment. So practitioners should be really clear about the non-debt related services to refer to, whether that's welfare benefits or housing, employment and training, counselling and advocacy. So yeah, seeing the debt advice within this this broader lens. And part of that is about the relationship building, which I think is absolutely crucial. So for a debt advice professional, or if you're involved in this area, to be building relationships with probation service, often local authority services, and services in the voluntary and community sector. So the next 3 slides discuss some of the systemic and policy challenges that people are going to face and that we need to respond to as professionals. And we highlighted 3 main areas of policy challenge around housing, around social security, and around some more, I suppose, recent issues caused by cost of living and financial vulnerability linked to that. So whilst the debt advice process is focusing on those priority, non-priority debts and the and providing an action plan for that. Underpinning that, we know that there's this really close correlation between debt and housing related problems. Accommodation often can be lost when entering custody, and on release there can be difficulties in securing housing, whether that's in the private sector or the social rented sector. And that can also be linked to problems with delays in the payment of welfare benefits. So in the best practice guide, we are discussing some more detail, some of the strategies or suggestions of how you might approach these issues. So in terms of housing, if someone does have an acute housing problem and needs to be supported through the homelessness processes, ensuring that local authorities discharge the full homelessness duties. As I'm sure you're aware, there can be a danger that the burden of proof to prove someone is homeless rests with the applicant, and that might be really difficult for someone who's leaving prison to prove. The burden of proof rests with them, but they might lack the ability or have the evidence to go through that process effectively. So support might be needed there. Might be some practical issues. People might need help with paying rent in advance or removal costs, help with a deposit. And so to certainly consider if there's assistance from a local authority, maybe with a discretionary housing payment or other grants, rent deposit or bond schemes, and also where appropriate to see if there's the kind of discretionary payment that can be paid to a housing provider when someone is released from prison. And then secondly, again, we know, and the literature clearly indicates these links between experience of the criminal justice system and the provision of social security. So around a quarter of out of work benefits are claimed by people with a criminal conviction. And equally, concerns have been raised that only a quarter of offenders leave prison and enter employment. So some interesting relationships and dimensions here, which would probably be warrant a whole separate research project around the extent to which the social security system is, on the one hand, providing financial support, but also for many people trying to encourage them into the work, but that can be problematic. Also, challenges were highlighted with stigma attached to offenders who claim welfare benefits. So it was interesting that we know in general terms there can be a stigma about welfare benefit claimants, but that could be intensified by offenders who claim benefits. And the guide, I don't intend to go into the technical detail on the call now, but most social security benefits not payable during a prison sentence. And so that means that the process of re-establishing entitlements is a really important part of financial capability and the debt advice process. So again, some of the suggestions, and again, I know this is hardwired into the debt advice process, are to complete a welfare benefits check, ensuring that all entitlements to means tested, non-means tested benefits and disability benefits are taken up. Again, pursuing where possible if there are more discretionary schemes. So as we know, councils have different local welfare assistance schemes with different criteria based on which local authority that is. Often there might be emergency support such as household items or food, and linking where possible with a DWP liaison officer before prison release. And I think the complications and the complexities around identifying entitlement to welfare benefits and then securing that entitlement that we know exists for anyone are again intensified for people in this situation. And I think it needs that really clear processes to be put in place and working wherever possible with other staff from agencies on the ground, local DWP staff, and local authority staff. And then finally, I guess because we were completing this analysis and research, we were writing these best practice guidelines in the last year or so. The kind of cost of living crisis started to cast a shadow over some of the things that we were looking at. So, of course, the increases in energy costs, food bills, national insurance exacerbate existing debt issues for lots of people and mean that new debt issues emerge. And so some of the things here that I suppose have become increasingly important over the last 12 months, looking at those national government schemes that are in place, cost of living payments, energy price guarantee, etc. Looking at things like ensuring if people are moving into work that national minimum wage has been paid, establishing whether there's entitlement to universal credit, and checking entitlement to free school meals and healthy start vouchers. And there's some really good information that I'm sure you're aware of on support with the cost of living from the Money Advice Service website, from Citizens Advice, and from the government's own website. So that is a whistle-stop tour through what we feel are some of our main findings, some of those complexities of the situation, and hopefully giving some strategies or food for thought about good practice in this area. The guide that we will share following this presentation has got a really excellent case study which demonstrates the really massive and positive impact of debt advice intervention. And it's really good that Sarah Fowler is on the call. The case study was very kindly provided as part of this project by Sarah, who you said at the start, Sarah, at that point in time, you're working at Derby City Mission, and you've got a similar role now working at another organisation within Derby. I hesitated whether to include the case study as part of this presentation, but I thought maybe I'll leave you wanting a little bit more. And I think the case study really brings together some of those issues that I've described this morning really well. And hopefully that will be a motivation, a further motivation, if needed, for you to look at the guide and to take some time to have a look at that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can there, but I'd like to have a little bit of time to pass over to you to just get some feedback. There might be some questions or queries, or some perhaps suggestions about areas for further research or elements of future collaboration. So I shall hand over to you. So I'm not sure in the chat, I wasn't able to keep an eye on the chat while I was talking there. So I'm not sure there's any specific queries from the chat at this point. But yeah, Grace, I don't know if there's. You look like you were pounced to say something then. I don't know if that was right.
Yeah, I was just monitoring the chat as well, just to say there's no kind of specific questions or queries in there, but general sort of interest. But yeah, I think feel free for people to pop their hands up or come off mute and ask questions. I have a couple, if that's all right.
Yeah. So do you want to go first, Grace, with your queries?
Yeah, sure. So just reflecting on what you said about the case study, I was just rereading that this morning actually, and it really does bring it to life, definitely. So yeah, just completely agree with that point. And let me know if you want me to pop a link to the report in the chat, Richard. I can do that if you want to. But the main thing that I was kind of interested in, I think you mentioned a couple of things through the presentation, was your views on what you think are the kind of main like gaps in the evidence base and where it does need sort of focus and building further.
Yeah, I think there's not a great deal of recent literature, and I think because the last, for me as a kind of someone who's really interested in policy, I think there's been for lots of different vulnerable groups have become more vulnerable over the last 10 years. And I think certainly we need to think about the impact of the cost of living crisis. I think of lack of affordable housing, around issues to do with the social security system. I think some of those general vulnerabilities have become far more acute, and I think it is really important that we've got an evidence base around that. I think unfortunately it's difficult or impossible to paint any other picture than some of those vulnerabilities that we've alluded to in the best practice guides and I've talked about this morning are being more acutely felt by people at the moment. So I do think that there's kind of research about which areas of policy have created those vulnerabilities and how we can respond to those. I think it'll also be important. And I know one of the interesting things of me working in local authority and then moving to academia is that I'm much more free to say exactly what I want. And it's interesting. I know that from a Ministry of Justice point of view, which I understand there's a kind of maybe a delicate balance between how much you can criticize policy in some ways. But I think the other element that's really important is in the build up to the general election is that these issues are seen as prominent, and we can campaign about those in kind of manifestos and with local politicians about the vulnerabilities that prisoners and ex-offenders experience. So yeah, yeah, hope that answers your question, Grace.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
So I hope you can tell me off after, Sarah, if this is very unfair, but because you were so helpful with the provision of information for the guide and that case study, I wondered if there was anything else, Sarah, that you would add that you think is kind of important from your experience working in this area. I guess if you had to kind of emphasize some of the effective strategies or challenges perhaps in this area.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess we have had our greatest success with people when we have built a relationship with them and try to really dig deep into the causes of their debt issues, because one of the most key things I think that you mentioned there was the lack of trust, and trying to get alongside people without them feeling like this is another person who's not going to take my issue seriously and who I have to cover up what's really happening. And once you can actually get beneath that and have a level of consistency in what you're doing, those when we've had the best responses, which obviously isn't easy to do and it takes quite a lot of time, but it's that building of trust is really important. Yeah, I think that's probably been where our bit for the projects that I've run, those are where our biggest successes have come from, when we can prove that we can actually solve this, but we have to build a little bit of relationship at least to get them to even begin to show us what's happening.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, apologies. That was very mean of me to come to you in that way.
But yeah.
And that I'm pleased you've emphasised that. And I suppose thinking also, I think it links to Grace's question about where there are gaps. What we hope that this guide in a small way can do is to provide, particularly through that case study, an example of best practice and how intervention works. And I think there probably is a lack of evidence which follows people through this process and very clearly indicates the positive consequences of quality debt advice and financial capability. A lot of the literature focuses on problems and barriers and issues, understandably, because we can't in any way marginalize those or minimize those. But yeah, I think that what was really powerful about the case study is that evidence that it really has worked. That this approach, Sarah, you absolutely were able to demonstrate that despite those challenges, it's had that really positive impact. So yeah, that maybe links to your question, Grace, but very powerfully what you've just said there, Sarah, that this is an area of great challenge, but these approaches that we've talked about have the potential to have some really very positive outcomes for people as well. Yeah, and I think if for all of us we can kind of gather evidence and demonstrate that, that's important. Okay, and I think Leanne had put in the chat that she kind of very much recognises what Sarah's been emphasising around trust. Lucy, I think your big yellow hand's gone up in the air, so so over to you, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, and it's really acute to speak about how wide the issues are and how linked they are into substance misuse in other areas. One of the things that we know with debt is it's one of the biggest drivers for self-harm and violence within prisons. And I suppose I've got kind of a two-pronged question. So there's inherited debt within prisons. So a prisoner comes in and goes into a cell, for example, that previous cellmate had debt. It's not their debt, for example, but then they inherit it. So it's kind of that question that you said around, owing other prisoners or owing other drug dealers, things like that, which isn't necessarily a legal requirement, in terms of priorities, but the threat of violence and fear and all of that around that is really quite acute, and how we tackle that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think the what's very evident is that this is perhaps the clearest example we've saw when preparing the best practice guidance, that in one sense the general good principles around debt advice just need to be used in this environment, but it's about actually recognizing those particular issues that a debt advisor wouldn't necessarily think about that, or that wouldn't be an issue that they had to consider if advising someone else. I hope this isn't too vague an answer, Lucy, but I think it comes back to approaching each debt advice situation in that kind of tailored and very individualized way, and trying to look behind some of the causes of debt, and utilizing other support as well, because if you're going in with a very kind of fixed approach, it's not going to work in this situation. So it's linked to Sarah's point, perhaps around that building of trust and thinking about what approach could be used to try and resolve some of those more informal debts. And that might link to issues around mental health and liaising with prison staff as well. So yeah, I think that would be my response to that. I don't know if there's anyone else on the call who would have anything else to kind of add in response to Lucy's question.
Nothing by way of response, but just to flag, Lucy, I'm not sure if you're aware, and I don't know all the details, but I think there is some other research ongoing about the issues you specifically mentioned. So happy to put you in touch with people more involved in that specific research if of interest to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Really appreciate that. Thank you. I know there is we are currently doing a debt study. I don't know if it's the same one that you.
It might be, might well be.
It might be. I don't know if it's specific enough around that. The other question, if you don't mind as well, while I'm here, is kind of linked. So I suppose continuing to accrue debts whilst in prison and how that affects families. So we often have partners and loved ones and family members who actually attempt to pay off these debts that people are accruing in prison, whether it be through, illicit economy, drugs, or whatever that debt is, and how that is kind of linked. So if you're given a debt advice to that offender or that prisoner, how the family are then supported as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting that I think we do reference this in the guide. There's a gendered element to that as well, actually, that there can often be financial vulnerability for women, based on debts accrued that are within that household, maybe in their name, but they're not fully in control of or might not have consented to. So I think that the principle there is around approaching the debt advice situation in that holistic way. I guess if you were advising someone in a more traditional setting, you would be looking at the overall household income, who else is in that household. There can be complications around debts that are jointly and severally liable, and who's liable for those anyway. But I think you're absolutely right that the main point is that you can't just look at the debts for perhaps someone who is in the prison situation. You need also to be looking at the wider family situation, and there could potentially be issues around coercion and consent there, but that does need to be looked at. Otherwise, you're only approaching the debt advice in a kind of very isolated way, and there's probably lots of hidden debts and accompanying issues that you're not looking at. So yeah, I don't think I had mentioned that in the presentation, but it certainly was talked about in the literature around vulnerability, around what's going on in the community. It certainly became apparent from the literature also around a cycle of offending and a cycle of debt. Often people can be catapulted back into that if the resettlement process, if there are problems with the resettlement process, and perhaps people being housed in areas that are inappropriate that immediately create vulnerability, including debt, or are rehoused close or with people that perhaps create more problems. So yeah.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the guide. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucy. So I'm aware that the clock is quickly ticking towards 11 o'clock. So definitely we'll provide copy of the guide. I think Grace has kindly said that I think she can put a link in the chat, but I'm pretty sure that I'd seen in the overall comms about this presentation that generally if there's information after a meeting such as this, we'll send you reports or information that we've referred to. So we'll certainly send you the best practice guide. And what I'd kind of really welcome is for this to be the start of kind of ongoing dialogue. If there's things hopefully in the guide that are helpful, I'd be happy to come and talk in perhaps individual team meetings people have got, but also to kind of share your experiences if there's this kind of queries or perhaps things that you feel at some point need to be added to this kind of evidence base. And thanks, Grace. I can see there's a link there, and that's just a kind of link to the. It's hosted by NTU, but it's freely available. That's a link that you don't need a password or anything for. So, I think I've done most of the talking, which I hope was interesting, but I propose that I cease to talk now in this meeting, but I will just give you the opportunity if there was anything else that anyone wanted to add before we finish. Grace, I don't think we've missed anything that we're hoping to cover, either in terms of the content or communications about how the Insights Festival works. I think we've probably covered all the bases. Don't know if there's any other practicalities or housekeeping.
No, I think we're all covered. Yeah, yeah, brilliant session. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Grace. Well, good to see some people that I've worked with and have really contributed. It's been very much a joint venture. And as I say, particularly Sarah, who's on the call, do have a look at that case study. That's kind of really brings to these issues to life. And it's good also to meet people this morning that I haven't previously known, and yeah, to keep in touch. So I shall log off in a second and enjoy the rest of the day. So take care.